Greetings, I am not Scott Zahn. This presentation covers the installation and basic configuration of the Epicor Eclipse Eterm text mode interface, which is the original interface that came with the Eclipse software back in the day, and is still used about 30% of the locations that run Eclipse, and are used by Eclipse administrators for some low-level functions that you cannot access in Solar. Before continuing, I would like to say that for those people and locations that are still using Eterm in a lot of their job functions, I would like to say stop it. Even though Eterm is my preferred interface, and I'm not really terribly a Solar fan because it tends to be sluggish and cluttered, all of the new functions that Epicor writes for the Eclipse software are in Solar, and their entire screens, sections, and functions you can't even see unless you're running the Solar interface. So if you are primarily using Eterm for a lot of job functions, try your hardest to discontinue it. Now, having said that in mind, there are some legitimate people and cases that do need to use Eterm. As I said, there are some system administrative functions and report writer functions and TCL functions that you absolutely have to use Eterm for, because they just didn't put those functions in Solar, and they probably never will. But anyway, having said that, I think version 4.25 was the last version of Eterm that they wrote. So you'll be installing off of that. It's a standard executable that you get from the Epicor website and download. Hopefully you have an account and access to that. And you double click and you start. For those of us with a Microsoft background, I'm sure you're all well versed with install shield packages being installed and the yes, yes, okay, next, next, continue thing. This is one of those, and you click next. I cannot fathom a case where you would not want to install this application in the normal default location. And I should also mention that this does work fine in terminal services and Citrix, so you shouldn't have any trouble installing it there. But normally you're just doing this in a normal Microsoft Windows machine. Yes, you run the typical setup installation. I can't imagine a time where you wouldn't want to. Eterm is such a small application that any customizations would be unnecessary. And finally you click finish and you get a little funny ancient looking icon that ends up on your desktop. During this process you might get the normal Microsoft Windows security warning, allow, deny stuff, and hopefully you're a system administrator of your machine, so you tell it to allow and let it finish its installation as necessary. And the installation part is complete, and then we do all the wonderful configuration stuff. As soon as you start Eterm for the first time, you'll be presented with the Configure Communications window. And before we go any further, I would like to say that this Eterm is an old application. Most of the configuration settings that you see in the thing were oriented around having dial-up modems and dialing up into the system. I assume you will not be doing that. In pretty much every case I can think of, you'll be using network telnet to connect to your server. And having said that, if you get through the configuration section and you're quite sure that you put in the right host and IP information and you're still not connecting, if you're running a cloud-based version of Eclipse, or Epicor is hosting it for you, the charming people in the networking and security department always think it's a great idea to by default disable the telnet port. And if that port is disabled, no amount of configuration of this thing is going to allow you to connect to your server. And you have been set up for failure. So if you're quite sure that you've got everything right and it's still not connecting, and usually when it goes to connect, it'll take a good 60-70 seconds of trying before it finally comes back and yells at you that it couldn't find the host. Go and fuss at your networking people, because they've probably set you up for failure and they really need to change the Red Hat Linux firewall and enable the telnet port. Having said that, now in the host field, you can, if you have a domain name server entry for your Eclipse server, you can go ahead and put in the name. I don't recommend doing that because I've had a few times in over 12 years or so where something crappy happened to my domain name server, usually a Microsoft box. It had a memory leak and lost its mind. And because I was clever and put in the DNS name instead of the IP address, people couldn't connect and do their work. And since most electrical distributors start working at about 5 o'clock in the morning, but us IT people tend to show up at 7:30 or 8, that meant that they couldn't do their work until I groggily showed up and rebooted the damn DNS server. So I would highly suggest you put in the IP address rather than the DNS name. Anyway, so you find the IP address to your Eclipse server, you put that in. These check marks here for enable debug, enable receive buffer, enable edit, auto connect, these are all the standard things. If you've got multiple Eclipse servers, some locations have a play server and a live server that they'll flip back and forth between with 2 different IP addresses. Then you'll uncheck the auto connect, but otherwise those checks are standard. Terminal ID we will get to next, and the receive extension, I have no idea what that is, and just leave it as it is. Okay, so what is the gobbledygook that's in the ID field? That is referred to in Eclipse as a terminal ID, and what these are used for is to identify the location that the computer or terminal that you're running is physically located at, and how to handle the transactions. Here you'll see the terminal setup in Eclipse. If you are the system administrator, you should have access to this section. And your installer and or your administrator will have set up various printers to be used and if you have multiple branches at multiple locations and multiple branches, and they will have set up these terminal IDs. And when that ID is put in, when you connect and log in, it tells the application what printer you're supposed to print out of when you print, and if you do a sales order or any other type of transaction, what warehouse you're booking the transaction to. So these are extremely important. If you don't put in that information, you can still log in, but just about any time you do anything in Eclipse and move from screen to screen, it's going to ask you what branch and what location you want to do whatever you're doing to. So you want to have the ID put in and make sure you got the right ones. So here you see an example of various locations. This is also kind of a security function as well. So for terminals that are set up with the counter location, that's got a special flag on it so that as soon as you do finish a sales order, it'll automatically log you out, because your counter people are usually grabbing whatever terminal is available, and you don't want to accidentally book the sale to the wrong salesman. That type of thing. And areas like accounts payable, you may have a security function set in place so that the check printer, which is run by the AP people, that only the check stock can be loaded and checks can be run off of that printer and executed off of a terminal that's using that ID. So you see, the terminal ID is very, very important, and you got to type it in. And anyway, so if you don't know what ID you're supposed to use, typically you go ahead and find whoever's next to you and take a look at their configuration and use that ID. Or, barring that, go talk to your system administrator and get the listing of what IDs go to what locations, and make your judgments from there. One of the first issues that you'll deal with as soon as you get Eterm set up and someone goes to log in and use it is you're probably going to get an immediate complaint from people about, how do I make my screen bigger? And this is an issue with Eterm because it's an old program that they just did minor modifications to over the years. And back in the day, all computer screens were square. And so you could hit an Alt key and it would go to either little screen or it would go full screen. Well, that doesn't work anymore, because now all computers have rectangular screens, and the application doesn't know how to scale itself to a rectangular screen very well. So in order to correct that, what you do is I know this doesn't make any sense at all, but you go to Configure Fonts and you select Eclipse Bold off the list. And when you do that and you log out and log back in again, that allows you to drag and scale the eTerm screen up to a size that they'll like. And unfortunately, it fiddles with the font, makes it a little thinner, a little harder to read, but since you've doubled the size of the screen, it all kind of balances out. Okay, so once you've got all that gobbledygook done, and you go ahead and close the application and restart it to make sure the configurations are working. If it connects properly, you will be presented with the Red Hat Enterprise Linux login, and keep in mind that it is extremely case sensitive. And this is always one of those kooky things with eTerm users, because we all have a habit of putting the caps lock on and doing everything in eTerm in caps. And that's fine. That makes things more readable in Eclipse. Unfortunately, if you forget to leave the caps lock on and you go to log out and log back in again, well, your login's going to fail. So make damn sure you take the damn idiot key off, and and put in your login in lowercase letters, or else he's going to bark at you. And no, of course, you cannot backspace or delete at the login screen. Once you've typed in a couple letters, went, nope, oh, I screwed it up. You're just going to have to enter and wait 10 or 20 seconds or so, where it's going to tell you, oh, no, you screwed up, that doesn't make any sense, and then present you with the login again. And it'll allow you to do that 2 or 3 times until it just disconnects and you have to restart it again. Once you've typed in your username correctly and hit enter, most people have their systems configured so it drops you right to the Eclipse application, and from this point onwards you're not dealing with Red Hat Linux, you're actually logging into Eclipse. And Eclipse is not case sensitive, so you can put the idiot key, the caps lock, back on again if you want, go from there, or do it later. Most people have their passwords set to only 4 characters or so, and the reason behind that was dealing with the counter. As we said, normal counter configurations, after you've finished a sales order, automatically logs you out. Well, if you decided to be evil bastard administrator and give everyone 29-digit alphanumeric upper lowercase and Cyrillic symbols passwords, they'd spend more time trying to log back in than doing sales order, and they will probably beat you to death in the parking lot. So most Eclipse configurations just use 4-character passwords. Once logged in successfully, you will have your main menu, and as you can see, yes, Eclipse is ugly, ugly, ugly when it comes to colors, blue and yellow and all that good stuff. But for functionality, you really can't beat it. And of course, someone's asking, oh, can you change the colors? Yes, you can change the colors and all that. I don't usually bother, because that's usually the best configuration. I've never needed to explain to users how to change their colors, because users are funny that way. Users, you'd have to draw them a diagram to find the men's room, but by God, if you set this up and walk away for 5 minutes, they will have already figured out how to turn on the bells and whistles and change the colors and rearrange the fonts and all kinds of crazy stuff like that. I don't know why that works that way, but such as it is. It is entirely possible that your menus will look completely different, because the way Eclipse works, it's got about 3 different security mechanisms that it uses to kind of segment out the different job functions. Of course, it's always a good idea to have your job functions segmented as best as possible. I realize that small electrical distributors, you've got a few people running many hats, and that's not always possible, but to reduce the potential for graft and corruption and things sneaking out the back door any more than you want them to, you try and segment things out as best you can. And so having the terminal locations set in certain ways, having certain functions only work in certain terminal locations, that's part of the security. Then with the users, then you have authorization keys and levels that only allow them to do certain things in certain screens, a lot of view only in some cases, or only edit customer information but not change the order. And then the final thing that they use as a security mechanism is to meddle with the menus. So your AP people tend to have a shorter menu, your sales order people have a different menu. Very few people in your company would actually have the full menu that you would see. and that's on purpose. And in later videos, maybe if I'm feeling insane or drunk, I might explain to all of you how to modify menus. Believe me, you don't want to go there if you don't have to. But don't be too shocked if you log in and you see a different menu than what you see here in these examples. That's perfectly normal. So as you can see, the Eterm user interface is pretty straightforward and self-explanatory. About the only things to say is the very upper menu where you see disconnect, edit, configure, print, and all that good stuff. You'll almost never touch that while the session is running, because most of those functions either don't work or they wouldn't do anything that you'd need done anyway. And in the lower end of the section there, in the left-hand section, when you log in successfully, the system will tell you what branch and what location that you're logged into. So in this case, the branch 1 accounts receivable section, so that tells me some idea of what authorizations I might have if I knew the system. And of course it'll also tell you what your default printer is. That's CP Credit Manager in this case. So most of the default forms will come out of that printer, so I have some clues to where to look. Now, of course, if you've got a systems administrator that's got a wicked sense of humor, he probably didn't label any of your printers and then go fish. But me, I like to actually stick big labels on the printers so that my users have half a chance in hell of finding the sheets that they printed. Aside from that, the rest of the knowledge of moving around Eterm doing things requires you to know how to use Eclipse, and therefore we won't go there with this one. I would like to say, though, that you see that big X in the corner. Younger users tend to do this all the time. They'll click on the X because they're used to windowing interfaces and things just go away, and that's fine. So they think of the X as, and the application. Do not do that in Eterm. If you want to end the application, end your session, you do F2 and O for log off. If you do not, you run a pretty good risk of hanging a session, hanging a transaction, and then your system administrator will have to go in there and try and find the session and unhang it, because it'll cause issues later on. So remember, the X is not your friend in this case. F2O, and there you go. As mentioned earlier, some companies have at least a couple of Eclipse servers. And usually one Eclipse server is used as a testing system to test out configurations and ideas before they roll that out in the live system. And in that case, you may have multiple IP addresses because you've got two physical different boxes that you're having to connect to. And as we saw with Eterm, since it was really designed for dial-up modems initially, and most of the configuration and such, it really on the network telnet thing, it wasn't really designed to do multiple hosts, but at some point they added a couple little patches in there to do that. The rest of these screens here pretty much deal with just adding the configuration to Eterm for multiple hosts. So in order to do that, what you do is in the configure communications, you put in the terminal ID, yes, but you don't put in the IP address. You leave that blank. And what you do is you put the IP information in the dial section. So first from the Eterm interface, you click on dial. Make sure you don't have a session going while you're doing this, because it won't mess anything up, but it's annoying. Sidetrack. After you click on the dial button, click on directory. You probably should have a blank entry unless someone's already done some pre-configuration there, and then if they have, you can probably stop. But go ahead and click on directory. So the first thing here you do in the dialing directory is go ahead and check network telnet, and go ahead and put in a name of something memorable for this particular server that you're going to. And in the phone number entry, obviously don't put in a phone number, put in either the DNS hostname entry if you're using a DNS system, or the IP address of the server itself, and then go ahead and click add. Since my company has two systems, I go ahead and put in all the entries for the second system and rinse and repeat, click add. Once you've got your entries in place and they're correct, you go ahead and click done. And once you're all done, it should look pretty much something like this. And then you can go ahead and close this screen. Once you've got the dialing entry information in for your couple of different servers, be sure to go to Configure Communications and uncheck Auto Connect, or else, well, it won't work. And it'll just override to what you see here. You don't have to delete any of the other entries. You can leave it in place in case you want to switch it back on and off at some point. Just uncheck Auto Connect and OK. So the way this will all work once you've got it in place is you'll go ahead and start Eterm, and it'll do nothing except give you a white screen because you've unchecked the Auto Connect. At that point, you go ahead and click Dial, and then the directory will show up here, and select whichever system it is that you're wanting to connect to, and then click Dial again. And if you did everything correctly, you'll get your wonderful Red Hat login. And remember, case sensitive. So hopefully, you've had your administrator set up the accounts with lowercase letters only. I can't imagine what administrator wouldn't, but yeah, every place is different. So after successful login, you should have your main menu and a blank screen. And as I said, depending on your security settings, authorization keys, menu templates, etc., your menu may look completely different. Usually it's only got 3 or 4 items on it, and depending on what your job function is. And as we said before, the X is not your friend. F2O is the only way to go. While keeping in mind, of course, it's entirely possible that you might have the menus altered in such a way that F2 doesn't equal system in yours, but I haven't seen a system that doesn't. So you might have to hunt around a little bit. If it's not F2 for system, find whichever function key is the system and select log off. This bit here I always thought was some of the strangest counterintuitive programming I've ever seen in my life, but after you successfully log off of the system and the screen goes blank and the session is disconnected, Eterm is immediately going to prompt you as to whether or not you want to reconnect the session again. And for most of us, in most cases, you're going to click on no, and then you have to click on the X to close this silly Eterm software. And that's strange, but that's the way life is. And since Epicor said several years ago that they've discontinued all future development on Eterm, that weird little goofy thinking is going to stay there for the duration, and that's, well, it just is what it is. This concludes our presentation on Eterm setup and basic configuration. I hope it's useful, and if not, well, at least mildly amusing. Once again, I am not Scott Zahn. Thank you.